Okay. Is the applicant here?
Yep, it's not here.
They're not going to be here?
It's a request for continuance by staff.
Pardon me?
It's a city-initiated request for continuance.
Right. Okay. So I'll call the meeting to order and ask if you would give the invocation.
Please rise. Let's pray. Father, we ask your blessings to be on our gathering this morning, and we pray, God, as we deal with the task before us and our agenda, that you would give us wisdom and understanding, and give us guidance, Lord, as we proceed. In your name, amen.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can we have a roll call, please?
Robert and Serby.
Here.
Barbara Craig. Russ Wynn.
Excuse me, is this going to be recorded?
We do not need a court reporter due to the fact that this is a request.
So you're not going to do the television either?
I believe it's on TV.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It'll be a very short meeting on television, but
I understand.
Russ Wynn.
Here.
Jeremy Carlander.
Here.
Richard Donnelly.
Here.
Roger Brunswick.
Here.
James Orster.
There's a quorum. I would ask for the approval of the minutes of the last meeting, please.
I'm motion approval.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Roll call.
Robert and Serby.
Here. Yes, sorry.
Barbara Craig. Russ Wynn.
Yes.
Sherman Carlander.
Yes?
Richard Donnelly.
Yes.
Roger Brunswick.
Yes.
Okay. Public comment, anyone? No public comment. Mr. Fegan, would you
how about if I call the case?
call the case?
Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, this is Popeye's Bonita Springs conventional rezoning request. I'm going to call both cases, RZN 1742260 BOS. The other case is again Popeye's, is a special exception request, SPE 1741849 BOS. Both are at the same location, which is 28186 South Tamiami Trail, Bonita Springs, Florida. At this time, city staff is requesting a continuance of this particular matter to the June 19th zoning board hearing beginning at 9 a.m. in accordance with section 4-228. City staff is entitled to one continuance as a matter of right. There were some things that needed to be corrected that we just ran out of time. I believe Mr. Fegan can further explain that to you if you have additional inquiry as to that. And that's it.
Yeah, I would like the members of the board to understand what happened here. I think it's important that you know why this is being adjourned. They are entitled as a matter of law to an adjournment. That's fine, no problem. But I think you should all be advised as to why it's being adjourned.
Sure. Mike Fegan for the record. Good morning. During the staff report preparation process, we have and I say we, I mean staff, we have a peer review system in place that is designed for quality assurance and quality control of the staff reports. So this could be, essentially what we do is we pull staff members from various disciplines, including outside counsel, and everybody gets a crack at the staff report, to input, and it could be anything from a spelling error, sentence structure, citing a code section. Everything gets reviewed, obviously, before it goes to print and comes before you. And that, again, that purpose is for quality assurance and quality control. And during one of the latter reviews, the team discovered an additional concern in the staff report that was not adequately addressed. So to avoid giving you a staff report that wasn't up to snuff, so to speak, staff is requesting a continuance of the case so they could better provide a staff report that meets the required standard of review.
So let me be a little bit more fulsome in that. When they say that they have a peer review, that includes, apparently, their outside counsel,
Yes, sir. Yes,
the Theriac law firm,
correct.
Theriac and Spain.
Yep.
And it was the Theriac law firm that discovered,
In this particular case, yes.
right.
Mhm.
So it was not the staff that discovered, it was the outside counsel. So I'm at a little bit of a loss how that would be a peer review. But enough said about that. Would you explain to the board what the actual error was and how this came about?
So, with this case is slated to be the first case that's a special exception under the US 41 overlay criteria since it was passed in 2015. So it is sort of the guinea pig case, if you will. There hasn't been a special exception case for a use on US 41 since that criteria came into play. And as a result, there are additional criteria beyond that of just the standard special exception criteria found elsewhere in the code and that applies everywhere else in the city. When I do my research, and I'll just speak for myself, I use a system called MuniCode. I'm sure many of you are familiar with MuniCode. MuniCode is it's a database that is used for general consumption, review, and use. It is the only online database that contains our entire land development code, our charter, and our comprehensive plan all in one location. So it is a very useful tool for staff, the applicant, the general public, the board. So that's what we use because that's where you can find everything all together. When I do my research, aside from, obviously looking at it from a substance point of view, when you're dealing with large quantities of code, to give you an example, Chapter 4 alone, which is the zoning code, is some 450 pages. You sort of learn how to train your eyes to go to certain places to get what you need to get. And as I was reviewing the old 41 criteria, and I looked at what the the US 41 criteria, and where it was in the Muni Code, it looked like it was a subsection of a very specific use that is targeted on that special exception list in US 41. So part of the US 41 criteria is that there's a list of uses that require a special exception. And then there is a subsection underneath that, under the last use, that lists these additional criteria. My understanding originally was that criteria was for that specific use, since it was a subset of that specific use. It turns out it applied to all of the uses on the list, which would have included Popeyes as well, a fast food restaurant. So that was discovered during the quality assurance, quality control system that we have in place. And obviously, rather than providing you with a staff report that doesn't meet the required standard of review, the request for a continuance was advised.
So let me see if I could make that a little bit simpler. There's an ordinance that got passed.
Correct?
That ordinance represents the law of Bonita Springs.
Correct.
Then there's a publication called MuniCode. And what they published was something that was different than what got passed.
Okay.
Follow me? So what staff relied on was the MuniCode and not the ordinance.
Right.
Now, am I explaining this correctly?
Yes, sir. You actually are doing a very good job, and I'm
So
just going
may-
to throw
may-
some
may I
numbers to you.
continue for a
Yes, sir.
second?
I'm here for your questions.
Thank you. I just want to, the difference is, as I understand it, so there are two cases here. One is they're asking for a rezoning, and then they're asking for a special exception.
Right.
The issue that requires the adjournment is in the second case, the special exception. In the ordinance that got passed, the law that we are obligated to follow, there is a provision that says you cannot have similar uses within 500 feet of each other. That was not what was considered by staff until it was discovered. It is also my understanding that the applicant did not bring that discrepancy to the attention of staff. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So they were prepared to proceed under,
False pretense.
well, that's a little harsh.
It was never picked up during sufficiencies.
Somehow, they either made the same mistake or they chose to turn a blind eye. I don't know. We can get into that at a later date. But I thought it was very important that you understand precisely what happened.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
the similar uses you speak to, are we talking about 2 chicken restaurants within?
We're talking
five-
about Wendy's and Kentucky Fried Chicken,
Fast food
2
restaurant.
fast food restaurants.
In general.
It doesn't have to be chicken.
Can't have 2 fast food restaurants
The
within
category-
500 feet.
The
of each-
ordinance adopted in order to try to keep things from getting centric towards either car-centric or
Okay.
fast food-centric, which is what triggered the special exception, had a 500-foot separation on new uses.
So,
This used to be a Burger King, but that's been decades ago.
please.
Who prepares the Muni Code? Is that you or is?
No,
oh,
let me explain, and this, actually, there's some U.S. Supreme Court cases on point on this. Unicode is the codifier. There's 2 companies nationally, I believe the other is American Legal. City of Bonita Springs went with Unicode, which is the largest codifier. Codifiers will sometimes, in their codification, they'll make editor changes, what they think is necessary, and that may include indents, modification that makes statutory, because ordinances, it's the same case law. Ordinances and statutes, you follow pretty much the same interpretation. So the codifiers, and no different than when the legislature makes
Yeah.
changes, the codifiers go in on the statutes and make it, because they sometimes have to reconcile 2 or 3 laws
it's together now.
to get it to read correctly. So it's sometimes a term of art. The clerk's office is the one that would be charged with the responsibility of making sure the ordinance gets over to Unicode, and we have it under contract. I believe it's 4 times a year. Is it 4 times or or twice a year that they go and perform the codification services of adding the new codes into the system? And when they make some of their editorial changes, we were talking about it on the way downstairs. We're doing impact, right now I'm modifying impact fee credits, and they made the modification of keeping fees, at that time, the decision in 2011, putting fees on file with the clerk's office. Now they have since changed it, and now I have to go back and, so there's a lot of interesting things that happen when you're actually constructing the ordinance. But there's cases where you go back to the original ordinance, and you'd be surprised how many times a court has relied on the codified, and the codified is incorrect.
So, so is it fair to say that it's the ordinance that is the legally binding?
Yes.
Yes, and so that when the codifier is wrong, the ordinance,
Correct.
okay, I just want to know what the.
Right,
legal-
so if you're going, that would be
hierarchy
your
was.
legislative history, you would go back into the actual physical ordinance, and you would look to determine whether or not that could correct. Sometimes you discover that doesn't correct it, but this is one of those circumstances where there was a misread.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
another question. So so I understand about, is the repair to this in order for them to proceed with their application, to request a variance to our overlay?
Special exception.
Special
There will-
exception?
There
That would
is-
be a use variance, so,
Well, there's going to be additional analysis that's prepared in the staff report. Because if you look at, and just to provide the focused details on this, the US 41 overlay includes uses that are approved by special exception. It also includes prohibited uses. Uses that require special exception go A to Z. Actually, A to Z. After Z, What happened was there is approval criteria, which is a separate section that is meant to apply to all uses that are required for a special exception. However, as opposed to moving that approval criteria to the left to show that it applied to everything underneath it, they indented to the right. So it looks like it's Z1 for approval criteria to deal with vehicle and equipment dealers, which would make sense because those approval criteria do apply to those, but they also apply to all of the other special exception uses that are listed. Had that indentation been to the left as opposed to the right, it would have been very clear as to what the applicability was. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it was not used. That analysis for those criteria was not included in your staff report because it does need to be in your staff report for this to be legally accepted and for you to review and approve. We have asked for the continuance so that analysis can be provided.
And let me just add, it's not a variance. Special exceptions are used, or special exception or the term special permit. Their origin really began with gas stations because you didn't want like 5 gas stations in one area. So you would have it by a special use or a special exception permit. And that would, that would be the traditional in Euclidean zoning where you would actually do the qualifications to see if it made sense. But that analysis has not been done yet by the applicant or by staff.
And could you give us a brief overview as to how or why the city council chose to do the US 41 overlay district?
Yes, sir. It was part of a overall approach to move away from car-centric uses and centralized car-centric uses to improve mobility within the city and also to alter development patterns so that they reflected current and best practices. And it was really one of their first steps to enact this process. And as part of that, what they did was that they set up, uses that I'm not going to say were inconsistent with that, but could be inconsistent with that. And those were listed as special exception uses. And the reason why they are, so that way you as a zoning board and ultimately the city council can look at those and determine what the impacts are, and if they wish to approve that use, they can do so with conditions in place to offset or mitigate those impacts. And much like a plan development rezoning would be, just different criteria and different process. This particular case, when we're looking at US 41, the uses that are included in this include auto parts store, auto service stations, boat storage, car washes, contractors, flea markets, rental and leasing establishments, theaters, transportation services, vehicle and equipment dealers. So those are the type of uses that the council has determined require a special exception and allow them the opportunity to specifically look at each of those sites to address the impacts.
Does anyone have any further questions?
And just, if you wish, I do have the printout from Unicode so you can see exactly how it was formatted and what we wish had been done.
Will this get corrected in Unicode?
It will be one of the things we bring to their attention. As the publishers, though, we are not, we don't tend to tell them where things go. They tend to move things as they see fit.
Right.
But this will be brought to their attention.
And it's not uncommon for the clerk's office to transmit requests saying, hey, we need these changed. I discovered a couple of years ago impact fees. We had like 7 criterias, and they took out all 7 of them. I was like startled.
So when you're doing your work, do you always rely on the Muni Code, or, I mean...
I'm a little bit
why
older,
aren't
so
you
I look at the
Why
book.
aren't you relying on the ordinance, which is the law?
They are published by the same company. And so whether you are looking at the version that's online or you are looking at the version that is in print, I particularly like the version that's in print. However, it is no different. It is formatted the same.
Right.
The only difference is the media which you're looking at as opposed to paper or a computer screen. The only way that this would have been formatted correctly is we went directly back to the ordinance. And as opposed to pulling individual ordinances for a review, we tend to look at the land development code as a whole because many sections of that code apply.
So then the question becomes, how did outside counsel find it?
They didn't find it so much as an error. They found it as a curiosity and asked a question.
Yeah, it was posed as a question. They weren't too sure either based on the way it read. It was more along the lines of they were asking for additional clarification from us as staff. Does this apply or not? Because if it doesn't, that's fine. But they weren't sure either because of the way it was. So it wasn't as, it wasn't, staff, you made an error. It was really posed as, based on the way this reads, it's confusing. We're not sure. Staff, what are your thoughts?
And at that point, we went back to the ordinance,
Yeah.
and when the ordinance was, the way the ordinance was formatted, it made it very clear that it does apply.
Right, and let me point out, if you look at ordinances, we have two different formats of ordinances. We have ordinances by year, and that's the individual ordinance as it's enacted. And then we also have the codified version, which Muni Code keeps. The by year is like PDF of what City Council adopted. And those so they're both available, and you can both take them in print or by computer. It's just a different way of doing research to take a look at it. So I'll give an example. If there was a statute I had to look at Friday, totally not related to zoning, and I had to go through the legislative session laws to see what they amended at what years to resurrect kind of the behavior or the conduct of government in relation, it was alcohol sales, dealing with nonprofits and alcohol. So not an exciting subject matter, but I wanted to look at that to see exactly how they amended the ordinance, or the statute over years to figure out a response.
Thank you. That's helpful.
We'll still need a motion
Yes.
for June 19th.
Are there any other questions?
No.
Make a motion.
Motion to,
To
grant the
proceed with the special exception.
No, to
As
grant
well
the
as the,
continuance.
To grant the
Both cases.
continuance,
for both cases.
for both cases, right?
yes.
I'll second that motion.
Any discussion?
Yes.
Roll call?
Robert and Serpy,
Yes.
Barbara Craig,
Yes.
Russ Wynn,
Yes.
Chairman Carlender,
Yes.
Richard Donnelly, Roger Brunswick.
Yes.
Before we adjourn, there's one more matter, Mr. Dulmer. The residents of Kings Q and Queens Q have put on on our desk a complaint, and I'd like to respond to them. It's not within our jurisdiction, obviously, but I think we do owe them. My concern is that they're concerned with having code enforcement view the activity of cars coming and going is irrelevant because the cars are still illegally parked. I'm not sure I understand what that sentence means, but it is for code enforcement to deal with this, is it not?
Yes, sir.
And
It is under the jurisdiction of code enforcement. However, it is something that we would work with them to interpret what is permitted and what is not permitted, and they would then take the action once a decision was made.
can
Yes,
you
sir.
do that?
Yes, sir. I'd
You
be
can
happy
get
to
a
do
hold
that
of
as soon as
them
we
and-
leave here.
Great.
Mr. Chairman, may I add something to, I remember a couple of years ago, I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years ago, that it was brought up about the parking down there. And I know that they had gone to, I think Frank Cassidy was in charge of it.
Mhm.
But nothing was ever done. And I just went by there a couple of weeks ago, and it's just, I mean, it's horrendous, really. But I don't know why nothing was ever done a couple of years ago when they initially complained about it.
I don't want to speak to this particular case, but what the approach tends to be a conversation that code enforcement would have with the property owner and let
Okay.
them know this is not permitted, not to do it again.
Right.
If it never happens again, it doesn't stay as an issue. If it does happen again, that's usually when they'll issue the violation and take formal action,
Right.
or at least provide them a written warning or something that can be documented. But usually that first contact tends to be just a verbal
A warning,
discussion.
yeah,
and-
okay.
Yes, sir.
All right,
But obviously, looks like we passed that point now.
thank you.
Is there anything further? Everybody has been heard who wants to be heard? Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion, so?
Second.
Roll call?
Robert and Serby.
Yes.
Barbara Craig.
Yes.
Russ Wynn.
Yes.
Chairman Callender.
Yes.
Richard Donnelly. Roger Brunswick.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for giving us that explanation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
All right. Very good.
Hey, Barbara, can I speak to you for a few minutes after?
Certainly. I guess we'll
Did
see
I
you
hear
all
the
on the 30th. Is that
continuance
our
need to be